Hey y'all, welcome to our Thursday session of History/GWS 457A, Manhood and Masculinity in the United States. We are in our very first online session. This is actually my second attempt at recording this particular lecture because Panopto didn't work right the first time, so attempt number 2, here's hoping it's the charm. I would say that I hope you all had a good spring break, but that feels a little weird to say in a time of, I don't know, global pandemic and crisis. So I will just settle for saying that I'm really glad that you are all here. I miss seeing your smiling faces, but I'm really grateful that you all are willing to make this adjustment to online learning along with me. Today I'm going to end up actually covering a little bit of a combination of the lecture I would have given you on Tuesday and the one I would have given you today. So I hope I didn't make it too dense, but I will say that I would love to hear how this experience is going for all of you. So I do plan to send a survey out after our class, and I would really appreciate it if you would fill that out and let me know how things are going and how you're doing. But as much as it's going to be an adjustment for online learning, I will say that I'm very excited about what we get to talk about today, because we're going to be talking about a really key period in the history of American masculinity, and also about the rise of something that scholars have labeled passionate masculinity, which is a version of masculinity that people often claim is going to replace the earlier hegemonic ideal of the self-made man. So let's talk a little bit about that. The period we're going to be discussing today is the period between about 1880 and about 1920. And as I have mentioned to you, this is a period that scholars of American masculinity have really fixated on. And they've fixated on it for several reasons. So why is this such a crucial period? Well, I want to propose 3 potential explanations. The first of these is that we can actually identify this as the period where the word masculinity came into regular usage. And not only came into usage, but came into usage in a way that was very similar to the way that you and I would use that term. And that was a new thing in the late 19th century. To put this in some perspective, one thing that we can say is it's worth thinking about our Byrd reading or our Benjamin Franklin reading in this class. When we talked about those readings, you all observed that Byrd and Franklin are both very much talking about the gendered expectations of men and women, and very much talking about what they thought the qualities that made a man were. And yet they're not calling those things masculinity. If anything, people in the 18th century, when they talked about the qualities men had, would sort of use 2 words. One of those was manhood. And by manhood, they meant the state of not being a boy, right? The general idea was you were either a boy or a man, and manhood marked the period of emerging from that juvenile state and becoming an adult male. And once you had become a man, once you had attained manhood, that wasn't something you could really lose again, right? It's sort of like the progression of time. You can't roll it back. And the second word that people would sometimes use in the 18th and early 19th century was manliness, by which they meant the qualities that were associated with a man of sort of good birth and good standing, right? Manliness were sort of the idealized qualities associated with men. People in the late 19th century talked about masculinity, and what they meant by masculinity was not a quality that men simply just had, or even a quality that men kind of attained and permanently kept. When they talked about masculinity, they meant something very much like what we talk about, an ideal for men that was actually very difficult for a lot of men to attain, and that many men were at constant risk of not attaining. People in the late 19th century were really concerned about the potential that American masculinity would be lost. And this brings me to our second point, why scholars have fixated so much on this period. Scholars have tended to argue that men during this period are unusually obsessed with questions of masculinity, of what it meant to be a man, and how American manhood could be preserved. Again, they are constantly worried that somehow being born male isn't enough, that there's other things that men have to do, not just to attain manhood or manliness, but to attain masculinity, the qualities that we want in a man. These, for them, are qualities that have to be repeatedly performed. Yes, Judith Butler comes up again in this class, demonstrated, and that have to be kind of carefully guarded from potential loss. There's always this sense among men in this period that masculinity might be lost. And then finally, the third reason that scholars have sort of fixated on this is a period where not only do people start using the word masculinity and fretting a lot about masculinity, but they actually start to agree with one another to an almost unprecedented extent about what masculinity was and what it meant. And I think that this has a lot to do with media during this time period. And in order to kind of explain this more, one thing we can point to is, well, we can say, thus far in this class, we've studied the colonial period, we've studied the late 18th century, we've studied the early 19th century, we've studied the Civil War, and during those time periods, we actually see a lot of different standards of masculinity floating around. Actually, we see a lot of different standards of masculinity floating around even within single time periods. So, for instance, Michael Kimmel made the argument to you that in the mid-19th century, the self-made man had sort of won out as the hegemonic ideal of American manhood. And yet, we know from our own readings, from our other readings, that there are plenty of men that really reject self-made manhood. We have Southerners who think of themselves as natural aristocrats and genteel patriarchs. We have jolly fellows living in cities and in some areas, sometimes rural areas of the countryside, who say, no, the marker of manhood is not restraint, and it's not success at business, it's how well you can fight, and how much you can drink, and how good you are at firefighting, right? So there's all these different standards. By the late 19th century, though, Americans are starting to agree on what hegemonic masculinity should look like. And I think that has a lot to do with changes in technology. And this is a great thing to be discussing as we do in our own online course and see how much the technologies that we're used to in our lives can collapse distances between, people, collapse time and space, and allow us to interact with people who might be very far away from us. This was something that was starting to occur in the late 19th century. Not only did you have national newspapers that were disseminating news stories all over the country, or it's the era of yellow journalism, but you had technologies like the telegraph that were making it possible to circulate information almost instantaneously from one end of the country to the other. You had certainly by the 1920s, telephones, right? People are able to call one another. You had radio. And so when we think about where we get our own ideas about manhood, I'm sure a lot of us would say things like, oh, TV, magazines, the internet, right? People in the late 19th century had a lot of media that was circulating ideas about what it meant to be a man to them. And as a result, they have a kind of unified standard. So those are three reasons that scholars tend to be fixated on this period. Now I want to turn to the questions for today. One thing we might ask is, okay, so scholars are fixated on this period because men in this period are really, really obsessed with defining, defending, and sort of ensuring that people can attain masculinity. Why are they so concerned about that? What do they perceive to be the stakes of defending American masculinity? And moreover, why did they feel the need to come up with a new standard of manhood? Why did these older hegemonic ideals about masculinity, including the ideal of the self-made man, start to fade from prominence in the 19th century? What is going on during that time period that is creating this sense of crisis? And I'm going to lecture a little bit about those questions. But for now, I'm actually going to turn those questions over to you so we can do a little brainstorming at the start. So, I'd like you to shift away from this video, go to our group chat, and see if you can't do a little brainstorming about why you think it would be that in the late 19th century, people are becoming so concerned with the future of American masculinity. Okay, so pause the video here. When we think about why it was that people in the late 19th century and early 20th century felt both dissatisfied with self-made manhood and felt the sense that masculinity was in a crisis period, we can identify a number of causes for this. And one that I would point to, and I think you really see this in your reading for today about Edgar Rice Burroughs and Tarzan, is that a lot of men in the late 19th and early 20th century felt like they were eclipsed by their father's generation. Older generations that had fought in the American Civil War had, as we've seen from our previous readings, really conceived of that conflict as the moment that they became men. And this was true, of course, for black men who fought in the war particularly, because the war for them led to emancipation, but it was also true for a lot of young white men who fought in that war. The average age of soldiers was 25 years old, and so you had quite a few people for whom that war felt like not only a manly struggle where they could establish their masculinity, but felt like a coming of age to them. And indeed, by about the 1880s or 1890s, you had a lot of Civil War veterans who were beginning to pen autobiographies and memoirs of the war in which they really highlighted the war as something that helped them transition from boyhood to manhood. And this is odd for us to think about, right? Because in truth, the Civil War was terrible. I mean, the cost to life, disease, famine, all of these things were awful, and yet men who were writing decades later tended to, in some cases, put this kind of shiny and romantic gloss on this struggle. And really, as you can see from this image, highlight the Civil War as something that was, ironically enough, a kind of national coming together where men on both sides participated in a heroic and manly struggle to establish the future of the nation. And of course, that's a kind of garbage recollection because the Confederacy was fighting very much to rend the nation apart and gain their independence. But still, this nostalgic memory of the war gives a lot of men who were too young to fight or who were born after the war a real sense that they're never going to live up to their fathers and that they have no war of their own to kind of establish themselves as men. And similarly, a lot of men found themselves dissatisfied by what they saw as their changing economic circumstances and changing nature of work. One of the things that Kimmel tells you, again, is that the self-made man, somebody who was born into modest means, who worked hard, who demonstrated good personal restraint, and eventually gained wealth and independence, was kind of the masculine ideal in the early republic. However, if we look at what's going on in the economy and the labor market in the late 19th century, we can begin to see that a lot of men were no longer in situations where it was possible for them to be the kind of independent producers who distinguished themselves in the workplace and gained their own, ability to own businesses as there had been in the early 19th century. That's just not something that's possible anymore. And this was happening for a number of reasons, including the fact that the U.S.'s industrial manufacturing sector is growing very rapidly in the late 19th century. And you can see this even if you look here. This is a picture of some men laboring in the Ford factories. A lot more men are starting to work in larger workplaces. And this is a huge transition in American life. We don't really have time to talk about sort of every facet of it, but for our purposes, we can highlight a few things that make this really different. this form of labor really different than what came before. And one of those is that in the early Republican antebellum period, so if we think about the period before the Civil War, much of the economic growth in the country had actually been driven by small-scale entrepreneurs. Not everybody was sort of an old-school artisan who made craft goods from start to finish, but they were still working for the most part in small shops without a lot of mechanized production. The average corporation in the era before the Civil War employed 2 to 5 people. That is obviously a very different situation than what we see happening after. In the aftermath of the Civil War, more and more people find themselves working not only in factories and concentrated sites of production that might employ dozens or even hundreds of people, but also find themselves working for corporations that sometimes employ thousands of people. And some of these people, as these folks are factory workers. Others of them are actually white-collar laborers. One thing we see during this period is the rise of sort of office work, because once you have these big corporate bureaucracies, you need people to manage the finances, you need people to do legal work, etc. And so by 1900, about 20% of the U.S. labor force is going to be white-collar workers, people doing office jobs and clerical work of the type that maybe you hope to do someday. And so they work in these very large bureaucratic structures that are quite different than the small shops that had existed before. And when we think about why this is such a transition, one thing we have to consider is if you work for a small family business or a small shop, your labor stands out, right? It's possible to really distinguish yourself. You exist as an individual. In large corporate structures, however, you are increasingly kind of anonymous. Men feel like they are cogs in machines, and they also feel very acutely that they don't have the same opportunities to sort of distinguish themselves and secure professional glory that their fathers had had. So there was one young lawyer working in the early 20th century who actually wrote quite enviously of his predecessors in previous generations. And what he said essentially was, when I decided to become a lawyer, I envisioned myself being like the lawyers of old who used to stand in courtrooms and give these grand speeches before captive audiences of, juries and spectators. But instead, what I ended up doing was I work in an office, right? All I do is fill out tax paperwork and just sit at my desk and do writing. There's no grand speeches, there's no eloquence to it, it's just bureaucracy. And so when we look at the employment situation during this period, we really see that men don't have a lot of opportunity for the kind of independence that they had prior, in prior generations in the 19th century. By 1890, the number of men who were self-employed, which we can think of as being independent proprietors, had fallen from 67% at the mid-century to only 37%. And that's not nothing, but it's a very big decline happening very quickly. There's also a growing sense among men, I think, during this period that they don't have the same financial opportunities that their predecessors had had. If you look at the concentrations of wealth in the Gilded Age, and I should have put a graph in this, but I didn't, so you just have to believe me on this one. We think of the Gilded Age, which is the period sort of following the Civil War into the late 19th century, as being an era of kind of robber barons, right? A lot of these corporate entities are owned by people who are just tremendously wealthy. And the difference in the amount of wealth they possess versus the amount of wealth the average person possesses is just huge. And actually, a lot of people argue that now we're in a sort of second Gilded Age or second progressive era because we're starting to see similar discrepancies between the amount of wealth owned by the top 1% and the bottom, say, 50% of people. But a lot of people kind of perceive this as a sign that it was very difficult to get ahead during this period economically. And another reason that they believed that is that this is a period sort of like our period that's been marred by a lot of deep recessions and depressions. that make it so that even people who feel like they've done everything right in their careers and everything right economically are losing their shirts. And so, for instance, there's a really bad depression in 1873, another awful economic panic and depression in 1893, another recession in 1897. And these incidents not only devastate a lot of Americans economically, but they also shake a lot of Americans' faith in the justness of the American economic system. And as they do so, they really shake older standards of self-made manhood, because the whole idea of that is, if you are prudent, if you are a Benjamin Franklin figure who sits down and arranges your day and makes sure that you're modest and temperate and all of these things that Benjamin Franklin tried to cultivate in himself, then your hard work will pay off and you will get ahead and you will eventually be able to control your own economic destiny. But as people begin to see themselves as embedded in this larger global economic system that seems capable of depriving people of their fortunes, not because they personally did something wrong, but just because of market fluctuations that are beyond any one individual's control, it starts to seem to a lot of people like being self-made is a sort of pipe dream, that hard work doesn't always get you where you want to be. And similarly, and this is a really kind of interesting I think, facet of American life, a lot of people are also becoming very concerned in this period that the changing nature of work and the changing nature of, well, where you live in America at this point is going to really lead to an outbreak of feminizing tendencies or emasculating tendencies in American life. And I've already mentioned to you that a growing number of men are starting to take white-collar employments. And those of you who have ever held office jobs know that they tend to be kind of stationary, right? You spend a lot of time sitting at a desk. You're not using your body for the most part for labor. You're using your brain. And for a lot of Americans, this was kind of distressing because the country had such a rural history. For such a long time, the majority of Americans had made their living as farmers, and there was this kind of idealization of the yeoman farmer idea, this independent producer who through the work of his own hands and tilling the soil makes his own living. Now, people are moving away from that in this particular period of history. As late as 1870, only a quarter of Americans lived in towns or cities with populations greater than 2,500. So 75% of Americans live in very rural places in 1870. By 1920, the majority of Americans will live in cities. And a lot of those people who live in cities are going to be doing a lot more mental labor than physical labor. And, you know, when we think about our white-collar workers, for instance, they're not making anything, right? They're following ever-fluctuating markets, they're following stock prices and supply lines and keeping up with the news in the forms of telegraphs and print media. And with all of this sort of sedentary work and all of this sort of brain work, people started to worry that men were using too much mental energy and not enough physical energy, that they were becoming sort of weak. And these fears were exacerbated by people's general fears about what urban life was going to do to people. I mean, of course, people are moving into cities because industries require a concentrated labor force. But people also worry that if Americans move into cities, they're going to become kind of over-accustomed to luxury. They're going to lose some of their kind of rugged frontier individualism and just get used to living in an over-civilized society. And you can see this in this quote from General Horace Porter. He claimed that boys were endangered in a quiet city, leading an unambitious, namby-pamby life surrounded by all the safeguards of civilization. And so you get this vision of urban life as sort of being too easy, which is ironic ironic because if you look at this picture, you can see people are very crammed together. There's a lot of slums and extremes of wealth and poverty, health and disease in American cities at this point, but people nevertheless worried that urban life was going to essentially make people soft. They were going to lose that toughness that has for so long been a kind of part of American identity. And if we think about this goes back to the American Revolution, when we saw, on one hand, people really embracing consumer goods to a degree that they had not before, but on the other hand, worrying that having too much prosperity, too much luxury, too much progress was going to make people essentially effeminate, effete, soft, over-coddled, etc. That is very much a fear and a sort of paradox that's been at the heart of American culture for a long time. And it really comes out during this period as a fear that luxury goods will make men feminine. And indeed, all these fears that men were becoming over-civilized would actually lead to the creation and tremendous popularization of a new disease category in the 1880s, and that disease was called neurasthenia. Now, I want to have you pause the video here for just a minute because I'm curious to ask you how many of you have ever heard of this disease before, and if so, where have you encountered it? What do you know about this? So pause here and we'll be back in a couple minutes. So neurasthenia, for those of you who haven't heard about it, is actually a disease of over-civilization. And this disease concept was popularized by a man named George Miller Beard in his book American Nervousness in 1881. Beard's general idea was that a lot of white middle-class American men were suffering from nervous disorders, essentially a little bit like what we might call nervous breakdowns today, but even more severe. And Beard thought something very interesting. He thought that the cause of this nervousness was actually something that earlier generations of men had identified as a good thing, and that's restraint. When we think about self-made manhood, one of the themes that came up over and over again is that it's good for men to restrain their impulses, right? To restrain their behaviors so that they can succeed in the business world. For Beard, though, restraint was not something that was healthy, at least not in the forms required for men who wanted to succeed in white-collar jobs. Instead, what was healthy for them was essentially being able to indulge at least some of their impulses or some of their tendencies towards physicality. So let's look at Beard's quote here. Constant inhibition, restraining normal feelings, keeping back, covering, holding in check atomic forces of the mind and body is an exhausting process. And to this process, all civilization is constantly subjected. So there we have civilization requires us to restrain ourselves, but that is a very tiring process, right? And specifically, Beard thought that the body was sort of like a battery. I mean, if you look at a battery, right, it has two ends, the positive and the negative. For Beard, the two ends were the physical and the mental. And in order to be healthy, Beard thought that essentially we needed to balance our physical and mental energies in a way that wasn't happening for a lot of white-collar men, right? A lot of white-collar men are using their brains, but not their bodies. And Beard thought that this was very unhealthy. He wrote, men, like batteries, need a reserve force, and men, like batteries, need to be measured by the amount of this reserve, and not by what they are compelled to expend in ordinary daily life. And so Beard thought that men who expended too much mental energy would actually drain their bodies of nerve fluid and make themselves weak and sickly, to the point that actually they, in some cases, were completely debilitated. They were not able to get out of bed, they were not able to function, they were not able to think clearly, they were not able to perform sexually. And for a lot of people, this led to anxieties that essentially white middle-class men were becoming so over-civilized that they would be unable to reproduce their own race, essentially. That immigrant men, black men, Chinese laborers who did physical work were going to be in much better health, much better vigor than white middle-class men. And there was this kind of deep belief that men, particularly white-collar workers, were going to be disadvantaged by this disease. And you really see this here. I'm going to go back actually very quickly. So we have this Dr. Hammond's nerve and brain tonic. This was one of the medications that was prescribed for neurasthenia. Other doctors actually recommended electroshock therapy, and this one is being applied to this guy's head. But I will tell you, when I was at a research facility in Philadelphia, I actually saw an ad in their medical collections. They had a tremendous popular medicine collection for an electroshock belt that would shock the testicles. I imagine that had customers lined up around the block to buy it. But this was a recommended cure for this disease at this time. But there were other cures as well, and we'll talk a little bit about that, hopefully, as we talk about your readings for today and Tarzan. But people are very, very concerned that men are becoming over-civilized to the point that they are crippling themselves. And I will add that part of the reason that this concern exists is you got to think about the context of this time period. The 1880s start a period of a new wave of immigration into the country, and the immigrants who are coming during this period are not, by and large, the sort of Western European immigrants that had been arriving earlier in the century. Many of them are Italian, Jewish, Eastern European, people that Americans actually think of as being racially other and even inferior during this period. And among sort of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who had long sort of believed in their own racial superiority, the influx of these new immigrant groups caused a lot of anxieties, particularly as white native-born men felt their grip on urban politics slipping as immigrants started to integrate themselves into quote-unquote political machines, win concessions from municipal governments, etc. So there's all these anxieties among white men in particular that they are going to be displaced by racial others, and that does include large numbers of African-American men and women who are flocking to U.S. cities in part. Well, you could maybe make an argument for economic opportunity, but I think a lot of it was just fleeing from a reign of terror that was happening down south as people were engaging in lynching campaigns in just mass numbers. So you have a great migration to a lot of northern cities that's prompting anxieties that essentially black men and immigrants are going to be taking jobs and taking positions of traditional political power from white men. And so in that context, we can see neurasthenia not just as being a kind of health concern, but as being a concern about the future of the white race. And even as there were fears of white men's over-civilization, another thing we can point to as a source of anxiety for men during this period is women's entrance into traditionally male spaces. And that includes both political spaces and spaces of employment. In the decades after the Civil War, a growing number of American women entered the waged labor force. Now note, I'm saying waged labor and not the workforce in general, because there is never a time in American history where women have not worked. Women are always doing household labor. But after the Civil War, as we start to see the rise of factories and other businesses like department stores, women are increasingly starting to take up work in industrial areas, in factories, in department stores. They're taking secretarial and clerical positions. And that means that they are not only starting to earn their own wages, but they're also gaining access to public space in a new way. Previously, women were supposed to be sort of relegated to the private world of the home and work, and the public sphere was masculine space. That is no longer the case to the same extent by the early 20th century. Women are starting to take streetcars. They're starting to go to amusement parks, dance halls. They're starting to earn their own money. And for a lot of men, that's somewhat threatening. Also threatening, women are starting to claim new political rights during this period. Among other things, women are very active at temperance campaigning. National prohibition, which, as you know, goes into effect in 1920, is passed largely because of the lobbying efforts of women who demand that the government prohibit the sale of alcohol as a means of protecting the American household. Now, I want to just ask you to pause again briefly so that I can ask you, why is it, knowing what you know about masculinity, that you think temperance campaigns by women might be perceived by men as sort of deeply threatening to masculinity, to masculine power, etc.? So pause for just a minute. Finally, and I promise this is getting towards the end of the lecture, women are also beginning to campaign at this point in time for the right to vote. You have a very strong suffrage movement that is really active from about the early 1870s, and I mean really active in terms of, prominent organizations, etc., and that is gaining a lot of success, particularly in Western states in the late 19th and early 20th century, and that is indeed pushing for a national amendment to the Constitution to allow women the right to vote for much of the early 20th century, which, of course, they will be successful in securing. But many men regard this push for women's political rights as threatening to their traditional male prerogatives. And I want to show you some images here very briefly. So this is one, and if you can't read this, it says, "Everybody works but mother. She's a suffragette." And that marks this, as, by the way, as a British image, because in the U.S. context, we usually say suffragists. So you can see what's going on here. It says, "I want to vote, but my wife won't let me." And then I want to show you a few other images on this next screen. Okay, this is anti-suffrage propaganda, and again, this is mostly British, but you would see similar things in the American context. So I want you to just take a minute to look at these and pause the chat, and then let's go get together and talk about what you're seeing in some of these images. And then we will talk a little bit about how you see these trends in sort of masculine anxiety in the early 20th century as being sort of reflected in the reading that you did for today on Tarzan. So this is the end of the lecture for today. Go to the chat and I'll see you there.